Most engines work in 4 stages, but this 2,000-pound monster only needed 2. This is the Detroit Diesel 71 series, a piece of industrial warfare that was too loud, too heavy, and too defiant for the modern highway. In a world of quiet plastic engines, the Screaming Jimmy was an anomaly. It did not have a standard oil pan. It had a leakage recovery system. It did not have a normal exhaust note. It had a 2,000 RPM howl that could be heard for 3 miles. It was a mechanical giant that required 0 electronics to run, and it refused to die even after the company that built it was sold off. But why did truckers call it the Green Leaker? And what is the terrifying runaway secret that made this engine a lethal liability for anyone who did not respect the iron? Detroit, 1938. You could still hear the presses hammering out cast iron blocks down on Jefferson Avenue, back when men wore coveralls and every hand smelled like 40 weight. The bosses wanted something that could outpull a gasoline engine, but without weighing down the rig like an anchor. The answer was 71 cubic inches per hole, 8 of them if you had the nerve. That is how you got the 8V71, a V8 that tipped the scales at about 2,300 pounds. Yeah, folks call it a 2,000-pound monster, but if you ever tried to lift one with a cherry picker, you would know the truth. It outweighed a Mazda Miata. The engineers did not care about comfort or quiet. They cared about packing the most grunt per pound, so they went with a 2-stroke design. Every downstroke is a power stroke, no wasted motion. Everything was steel, cast iron, or copper. Aluminum was for fancy pistons, not for the bones of the beast. The war drums were already beating in Europe, and every man on that floor knew this engine was not just for hauling freight. It was being built for something bigger, something that would need every ounce of power Detroit could squeeze out of a block. The real test didn't happen on paper or in a quiet lab. It happened with boots in the mud, under fire, when the Army dropped the 8V71 into tanks rolling through North Africa and Europe. The boys driving those M3A4s and Shermans didn't care about brochures. They cared about getting home. That engine took a beating. Detroit started reinforcing the crankcase with thick steel ribs and sealing up the blower so sand and dust couldn't choke it out. They added a vented breather too, so when the oil got hot and angry, it could expand without blowing the seals clean off. In 1943 alone, Detroit cranked out nearly 58,000 of these engines, with about 12% going straight into tanks. You'd hear that high-pitched scream echoing across the lines, a sound every crewman learned to trust. One tank vet said, "If the Jimmy's howling, we're still moving." That's how you know a design's got backbone. It keeps men alive. Pop the side covers on an 8V71, and you're staring at a machine built for relentless motion. Every downstroke is a power stroke. No idle cycles, no wasted turns. That's the 2-stroke signature. Fire on every revolution, 8 times for every spin of the crank. But this engine can't breathe alone. It needs a roots blower, gear-driven and tireless, forcing air in with each turn. The blower spins at about 2.5 times crank speed, delivering 10 pounds per square inch of boost just to keep up. At highway pace, that is 5,000 to 5,200 revolutions per minute on the blower, while the engine itself is only turning 2,100. The result is a high-pitched howl. Rotors spin so fast they create a sound that lingers long after shutdown. Air isn't just shoved in at random. The blower pushes it through intake ports at the base of each cylinder, sweeping out exhaust and packing in fresh charge. That's scavenging, the critical dance of air and spent gases. Done right, it clears the cylinder for a clean hit every 0.00357 seconds. That's 280 times a second at cruise. Each pulse a jolt you can feel in the floor and through your bones. Fuel delivery is just as precise. Each cylinder gets its own mechanical unit injector, cam-driven, no electronics, just metal and timing. The cam lobe meters the shot, starting about 12 degrees before top dead center, firing at around 2,000 pounds per square inch. The window is narrow, miss it, and the engine will cough, knock, or belch smoke. Get it right, and every piston lands with authority, fuel, and air meeting at the perfect instant. Old hands say you have to keep it wound out. Lug it, and you'll flood it. Keep it revving, and you'll wring out every ounce Detroit built into it. The gear train below keeps everything synchronized. Crank, blower, oil pump, fuel pump, each spinning to its own ratio. The blower runs hot, pushing so much air you can hear the pressure hiss if you loosen a fitting. That 280 Hertz firestorm, 8 cylinders, 1 fire per revolution, creates the illusion of double the speed, making a 2,100 revolutions per minute. Detroit sound like a 4,000 revolutions per minute gasoline engine. But push the system too far. Let the blower outrun the crank, or let an injector stick, and you risk runaway. Too much air, or a dribbling injector, and the engine stops listening to the governor. Physics takes over, indifferent to warnings or intentions. That's why you keep a hand near the kill switch and never get complacent. The first time you heard a Detroit, it stuck with you. That high-pitched whine, sharp as a dentist's drill, cut through everything, clocking in at 280 cycles a second. The 8V71's signature trick was it made your ears swear the engine was spinning twice as fast as it really was. Old hands called it the screaming Jimmy. You could pick out that sound from miles away, echoing down a frosty highway. Mechanics joke that if you lost your hearing, blame the firewall of a Greyhound with the pedal down and nothing but sheet metal between you and the blower. But the Detroit didn't just announce itself by sound. After a long haul, you'd find its mark on the pavement, a green, oily trail stretching from the crankcase vent. That was Detroit slobber. Engineers called it a leakage recovery system, but every mechanic knew the truth. If a Detroit wasn't leaking, it was empty. The 8V71 didn't just burn diesel, it staked its claim with oil. That green mist wasn't a flaw, it was proof the system was alive, recirculating what it could, losing the rest to the wind, wiping down the airbox, checking the valve, topping off the 40 weight, just part of the ritual. If you wanted a dry engine, you bought something else. People like to throw around numbers like 2,000 pounds of iron, but that was just truck stop talk. The real number, if you were the one muscling it into place, was closer to 2,300 pounds. More than a Miata, all in a V8 block. Try moving one with a cherry picker, and you'd feel every bit of that weight. Detroit didn't build these for the spec sheet. They built them to survive heat, dust, bad fuel, and drivers who couldn't double clutch if their life depended on it. Double clutching was a dance. Miss a gear, let the revs drop, and you'd flood the engine, lose that sweet spot where blower and injectors sang together. The only way to keep a Detroit happy was to drive it hard. Lug it and you'd get smoke, maybe a cough from the airbox. The motto was simple: drive it like you hate it, or it'll hate you right back. Old-timers remember oil stains on their boots, ringing ears, and the green stripe down the shop floor. But there was pride in it. You learned to read the engine by the color of its leaks and the pitch of its scream. And if that pitch ever changed, higher, sharper, frantic, you kept your hand near the kill switch. Because a Detroit eating its own oil never asked permission. It just ran until something gave. That was the edge you lived on, every mile, every shift, trusting the monster behind you and loving it for every quirk. Runaway doesn't start with a bang. It creeps in, slow and sneaky, then hits like a hammer. One moment you've got your foot steady, the engine singing that familiar high note, the floorboards buzzing under your boots. Then something slips, maybe a tired injector dribbling where it shouldn't, maybe a blower seal weeping oil into the airbox. The governor's not in charge anymore. The engine finds its own fuel, starts feeding on oil, and all the rules go out the window. I remember the Ohio case, 1978. Hot July, dump truck loaded heavy, rolling down US 30. The driver felt the pedal go dead, but the revs kept climbing. Attach needle shot past 2,400, then 2,800, then straight to 3,200. That is not just a number. That is the sound of every bearing, every rod, screaming for mercy. The whole rig shuddered like it was about to shake itself apart. The driver did not freeze. He yanked the air shutoff, stomped the brakes, tried to kill the fuel. But once a Detroit gets a taste for its own oil, you're just along for the ride. The engine kept screaming, blower howling, until the rear axle let go. It snapped clean and sent the truck sideways into the median. 85 folks ended up in the hospital that day, and the NTSB tore that engine down right to the block, looking for answers. Every old hand knows that feeling when the pitch goes from high to frantic, when the whole bus or truck starts to vibrate like a jackhammer. You keep your hand close to the kill switch, eyes on the gauges, praying the next mile isn't your last. That is why we say, drive it like you hate it, or it'll eat you alive. Stopping a runaway Detroit is not about luck. It is about knowing your machine and never getting lazy. Every rig I ran had a spring-loaded air shutoff bolted right to the blower. You do not wait for the engine to start screaming bloody murder. You keep your hand close to that lever, ready to yank it the second things go sideways. That shutoff is not just a chunk of steel, it is your last line. When the blower pressure spikes past 25 pounds per square inch, the valve slams shut so hard you can feel it in the seat, choking off the air and starving the beast. No air, no combustion. The engine dies, no matter how much oil it is trying to eat. Fleet protocol was gospel. Every quarter, like clockwork, you pop the cover, check the spring tension, and make sure that valve snaps closed at the right pressure. A sticky valve or a tired spring is a loaded gun pointed at your back. Miss an inspection, and you are gambling with metal and lives. We ran pressure tests, cranked the engine, watched the gauge, and listened for that hard click at 25 pounds per square inch. If it is slow or mushy, you rebuild it. No excuses. I drilled it into every driver and wrench turner. You do not trust the governor, and you do not trust the fuel shutoff alone. Only the air kill guarantees the engine cannot feed itself when it goes rogue. That is the difference between a close call and a pile of twisted rods. Zero runaway was the rule. You want to keep the monster on your side? Never skip the shutoff test. That is the only way to keep the scream under control and the wheels rolling safe. Regulations hit like a sledgehammer, and the old Detroit never stood a chance. In 1992, the EPA rolled out Tier 1 standards, numbers that looked harmless on paper, but to a two-stroke, they might as well have been a death sentence. NOx could not go above 2.5 grams per kilowatt hour. Hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide had to stay under 0.2 grams per kilowatt hour. That is government math, not shop math. But here is what it meant. The 8V71, even with its best Sunday clothes, was cranking out 4.8 grams of NOx per kilowatt hour. That was almost double the limit, and that was before you even talked about the haze coming out the stack. I remember the first time a state inspector hooked up the sniffer to one of my highway rigs. The printout did not lie. The numbers were red across the board. No amount of injector tuning or careful driving could get that old iron to play by the new rules. You could slap on an oxidation catalyst or try to run EGR, but all you got was less power, more heat, and a driver ready to mutiny. The boys at Detroit tried, I will give them that. They ran test cycles, tweaked the injectors, even talked about electronic governors. But every fix just made the engine heavier, thirstier, or meaner to keep alive. By 1998, Tier 2 came in swinging. Now NOx had to hit 0.2 grams per kilowatt hour. That was not just tightening the belt. That was choking the old monster out of the room. The EPA yanked certification for any new two-stroke in a highway truck, no exceptions. I still have the bulletin from Detroit Diesel, dated December that year. It said last 8V71 highway engine shipped. The ink was not even dry before the big fleet started pulling their jimmies out of service. The industry made noise. The American Trucking Association filed a brief arguing the 71's fuel economy and reliability. It did not matter. The EPA responded with a simple answer: public health first, nostalgia last. The numbers were not up for debate. If you want to run a road rig, you play by the new rules. That was the end of it. Out in the yard, engines that had screamed across 1,000,000 miles got parked for good. You could feel the air change, quieter, maybe cleaner, but missing that familiar whine. The old-timers grumbled, but the law did not care about shop lore. There is no fighting a number printed in the Federal Register. When the policy hammer falls, even a 2,300-pound monster cannot muscle its way through. When Detroit Diesel pulled the plug in December 1998, the last 8V71 highway engine rolled out under a cold warehouse light, serial stamped and bound for a fleet that probably didn't want to let go. That was the end of the line, at least on paper. The new bosses in Germany didn't care about old iron. They wanted four-stroke engines, computers, and engines that didn't leave a trail of green on the shop floor. Daimler Chrysler took the keys, shut the doors, and told the world the two-stroke era was over. But out on the highway, you could still hear the echoes, not just in the stories, but in the way your ears would ring after a shift behind that firewall. A Detroit at full song could hit 115 decibels in the cab, enough to leave your ears humming for days. Enough that NIOSH started handing out hearing tests to every driver who had spent more than a year on the line. By the early 1990s, they found that nearly 1 out of 5 long-haul bus drivers had lost a chunk of their hearing, and nobody was surprised. That howl was not background noise, it was a living thing. You would feel it in your jaw, your boots, the steering wheel. Mechanics joked about Jimmy Ear, the permanent buzz you carried home, like a badge of honor or a warning to the next guy. When the big fleet started swapping out their Detroits for quiet, electronic engines, it felt like the world was losing its pulse. The shop got quieter, sure, but something was missing. The old-timers would linger by the fence, listening for that unmistakable whine on the wind, hoping a straggler might roll through. Some couldn't let go. A handful of diehards started preservation clubs, Jimmy clubs they called them, where you could still find a 71 getting rebuilt on a Saturday, oil stains on the concrete, coffee on the workbench, and the air thick with diesel and stories. They would run the engines up for the crowd, let that 280 hertz scream bounce off the walls, and you would see grown men grin like kids. Museums picked up the torch too. The Henry Ford has a cutaway 8V71 on display, all its guts exposed, blowers, injectors, the works. Folks stand around, marveling at the size, the weight, the sheer stubbornness of it. You hear the same line every time. They don't build them like this anymore. And they are right. The last one left the line in 1998, but the legend outlasted the company, the regulations, and maybe even the country that built it. Every time someone fires up an old green leaker, every time that scream cuts through the quiet, you remember what it meant to drive it like you hate it and love it for every mile it gave back. Out here, the highways are quieter, the oil stains fewer, but you'll still find a few Detroits shaking the paint off some old steel. 2,300 pounds of noise and stubbornness, not 2,000 if you are counting. They outlasted the suits, the EPA, and damn near their own legend. In a world chasing silence and software, some machines still demand you drive it like you hate it. Drop your Detroit stories in the comments below.